What if the truth of cinema wasn't written in scripts, but hidden in the frames they tried to burn? There are films born in the quiet corners of the industry, where editors cut quickly, censors cut deeper, and entire reels disappear before anyone can ask why. In the final years of the 1970s and through the turbulent 1980s, movies were no longer just entertainment. They became mirrors reflecting fears no one wanted to acknowledge. Violence wasn't merely staged, it echoed global anxieties. Satire wasn't harmless, it exposed the decay behind polite society. And realism, when pushed too far, forced audiences and studios to confront truths they were desperate to escape. Some of these films were banned before they were understood. Others were mocked until their messages resurfaced decades later. A few survived only in whispers preserved not by studios, but by those who refused to let the last remaining prints vanish into the dark. These 5 films, raw, relentless, and uncomfortably honest, reveal the side of cinema crafted not for applause, but for confrontation. They weren't supposed to be remembered, but shadows have a way of keeping their own records. These are the 5 films that revealed what Hollywood tried to hide. Film 1. Cannibal Holocaust, 1980. It began with a film that looked too real for its own good. A project marketed as a harsh adventure into uncharted territory suddenly became something far more dangerous. A movie that blurred the line between performance and reality so completely that even the courts stepped in to demand an explanation. Cannibal Holocaust, directed by Ruggero Deodato, arrived in 1980 as a mock documentary meant to expose the hunger of Western media for sensationalism. Instead, it ignited a global panic that questioned whether a camera could ever tell the truth without distorting it. On the surface, the film promised an intense survival narrative, an expedition lost in the jungle, their footage discovered after the fact. Audiences were told they would watch a fictional reconstruction, nothing more. Yet the way the movie was framed made it feel like a recovered artifact, a piece of journalism rather than cinema. Promotions leaned into this illusion, presenting the footage as if it had been carved out of a real catastrophe. For many viewers, the fictional line thinned to the point of vanishing. But the hidden truth behind the film was even more unsettling. Its structure, a documentary within a documentary, exposed the tendency of news media to manipulate suffering into spectacle. Authorities misread that intention, launching investigations that forced Deodato to prove his actors were alive and unharmed. Countries banned the film for decades, not only for its brutality, but because it held up a mirror to the voyeurism they preferred to ignore. Beneath the chaos, the film whispered a bitter message: when a story feels too real, the world would rather silence it than confront the reflection it casts. And in the end, Cannibal Holocaust became more than a film. It became a warning that the pursuit of authenticity can destroy everything around it, including the people who try to capture it. Film 2 Man Bites Dog, 1992. It opened with the kind of laughter that chills more than it comforts. Man Bites Dog, released in 1992 by Belgian filmmakers Remy Belvaux, André Bonzel, and Benoit Poelvoorde, arrived as a black-and-white satire that dared to take one step further than anyone expected. What looked like a low-budget mockumentary about a charismatic criminal slowly dissolved into something far more disturbing, a portrait of a film crew losing its soul frame by frame. In a decade obsessed with reality television and the illusion of authenticity, this movie asked a question no one wanted to answer. What happens when the people behind the camera stop being witnesses and start becoming accomplices? Audiences were told they were watching a dark comedy, a playful distortion of crime documentaries. The film festivals that accepted it promoted the work as a clever, daring experiment. It was pitched with the confidence of a student film made bold by its own ambition. Its grainy cinematography and handheld movement were sold as stylistic choices, the kind of rough edges that belonged to independent cinema of the early 90s. But beneath that surface was a truth sharp enough to cut. The deeper the film dives into its narrative, the more the crew abandons their role as observers. Slowly, subtly, they cross the invisible line that separates documentation from participation. At first, they follow. Then they suggest. Eventually, they help. The film becomes a metaphor for every moment when media turns tragedy into entertainment. This wasn't simply a satire. It was a confession disguised as fiction, revealing how easily morality erodes when a camera becomes a shield. The lasting twist is that Man Bites Dog was never about its character's cruelty. It was about ours. The film forced audiences to recognize that the moment we watch violence without looking away, we too become part of the story. And perhaps that was the truth people feared most. Film 3 Turkey Shoot, 1982. It emerged from the early 1980s like a warning masquerading as a B-movie. Turkey Shoot, directed by Brian Trenchard Smith, arrived dressed in the aesthetics of exploitation. Cinema, loud, violent, chaotic. But beneath that surface lived a portrait of a society collapsing under the weight of fear and authority. It was marketed as a dystopian action spectacle, the kind of late-night grindhouse feature meant to shock rather than provoke thought. Yet from its opening frames, something felt different. This wasn't a film simply indulging in brutality. It was using that brutality as a language. Promotions painted it as a wild chase through a totalitarian future where prisoners are hunted for sport and rebellion is snuffed out with mechanical efficiency. Audiences were told to expect excess, the kind that defined Australian exploitation filmmaking at the time. Posters highlighted chaos. Trailers leaned into spectacle. It seemed on the surface like entertainment built from noise and adrenaline. But the hidden truth of Turkey Shoot was much sharper. Behind every explosion and every act of cruelty was an allegory about governments manufacturing fear to justify control. The film reflected anxieties of the era, the rise of authoritarian rhetoric, growing distrust in institutions, and the sense that personal freedoms were shrinking behind closed doors. Censors across various countries misunderstood or ignored that subtext, focusing instead on its graphic imagery. Cuts were demanded, entire sequences vanished, and in some places the film survived only as a fragmented version of the director's intent. What was meant to be a satire became a symbol of how easily uncomfortable political commentary can be buried beneath the label of too extreme. And in the end, Turkey Shoot left behind a question that lingers long after the last frame. When a society begins hunting its own people, is the violence the problem or the silence that allows it? Film 4. Southern Comfort, 1981. It began with the sound of boots sinking into the Louisiana swamp, a quiet rhythm hiding a deeper tension. Southern Comfort, directed by Walter Hill in 1981, appeared at first to be a simple survival thriller. A group of National Guardsmen lost in unfamiliar territory, hunted by those who know the land better than they do. That was the surface, the official story, the one Hollywood used to frame the film as a tense, atmospheric action piece. Yet from the start, every shot felt heavier than the narrative suggested, as if the trees themselves carried the memory of a different war. Marketed as a gritty tale of men pushed into conflict, the film was positioned alongside Hill's signature-style stoic characters, unspoken rivalries, danger lurking in the shadows. Trailers highlighted gunfire and pursuit, giving audiences the impression of a straightforward chase through treacherous terrain. But beneath that exterior lived something far more unsettling, a metaphor so close to reality that distributors hesitated to define it. The hidden truth of Southern Comfort is that it was never merely about soldiers lost in a swamp. It was a reflection of the United States' lingering scars after Vietnam, a portrait of confusion and paranoia born from a war whose lessons remained unresolved. The Cajun hunters became stand-ins for a culture misunderstood and underestimated, mirroring the foreign landscapes American troops once marched into without comprehension. Hollywood avoided emphasizing this interpretation, fearing that audiences in the early 1980s were still too raw to revisit the wounds of a conflict that had divided a nation. What remains is a film wrapped in metaphor, where every miscommunication, every misstep, and every burst of violence speaks to a deeper truth. Wars don't end when the soldiers return home. They echo in the places they enter, in the shadows they disturb, and in the battles they carry silently within themselves. Film 5. Death Wish 3, 1985. It arrived in 1985 with a roar that drowned out its own message. Death Wish 3, directed by Michael Winner and starring Charles Bronson, was marketed as the pinnacle of vigilante action, a film where a lone man stands against overwhelming urban decay. On posters and trailers, it looked like pure adrenaline explosions, ambushes, gangs pouring through the streets like a tide of chaos. It seemed at first glance like the kind of unapologetic spectacle the decade demanded a piece of cinematic catharsis for audiences tired of crime headlines and political promises. But even within its surface bravado, something more complex was unfolding. The promotional campaign pitched the movie as a thrilling escalation of the franchise, a louder, fiercer return of a hardened anti-hero. Audiences were told to expect a fantasy of justice, a world where the powerless finally take control. The studio leaned into that fantasy, amplifying the film's violence as though it were a selling point rather than a narrative device. Hidden beneath the spectacle, however, was a film shaped by tension not just on screen, but behind the camera. Conflicting visions between the director, the studio, and Bronson himself resulted in a tone that wavered between satire and sincerity, creating a story that felt both exaggerated and eerily reflective of the era's fears. The film became a lightning rod for debate, accused of fueling a culture of fear, even as it tried to criticize it. Its depiction of crime-ridden streets mirrored a nation grappling with rising anxieties about urban life, political polarization, and the question of who should hold the power to protect. In the end, Death Wish 3 stands as a reminder that when a society feels cornered, it sometimes embraces the loudest form of justice, even if that justice reveals more about collective fear than true strength. Beneath the gunfire and broken streets, the film whispers a deeper truth. The real battle is not fought outside, but within the narratives we choose to believe. Bonus fact: the film that vanished before it could be feared. There is a film almost no one saw in time, a project whispered about, more than it was ever discussed openly. It resurfaced only in fragments, surviving through collectors' tapes and half-remembered festival screenings. Not because it failed, but because it revealed too much. This was the day the world ended. Not the 1950s classic, but the obscure 1980s cut that seemed to echo the collective paranoia of its era. Directed by a filmmaker who never received proper credit, the movie blended post-apocalyptic dread with an unnerving sense of moral collapse. It felt less like a story and more like a confession buried beneath layers of dust. When it was first completed, distributors hesitated. The film's portrayal of institutional breakdown struck too close to political nerves, and its bleak tone clashed with the decade's appetite for triumphant heroes. Early test audiences described it as too real a phrase that became the unofficial reason for its silence. Rather than risk controversy, the studio quietly shelved it. Prints were misplaced, promotional materials withdrawn, and the film slipped into a gray zone between memory and myth. For years, its existence was debated, not for its quality, but for what it dared to imply. Only fragments survive today. A reel discovered at a closed theater. A degraded VHS copy found in a private archive. A few production stills hinting at a narrative the world never fully received. What remains is not a complete movie, but a silhouette of one, a reminder of how easily a story can disappear when it refuses to align with the version of reality others want to protect. Some films fail on screen. Others were never even allowed to fail. Cinema has always been a negotiation between truth and illusion. And these 5 films exist exactly at the point where that balance breaks. Cannibal Holocaust showed how easily the hunger for authenticity can spiral into fear. Man Bites Dog exposed the quiet moral erosion that happens when a camera becomes a shield rather than a witness. Turkey Shoot warned that when a society allows fear to shape its laws, cruelty becomes a language spoken without hesitation. Southern Comfort revealed the echoes of a war that refused to fade, a conflict carried silently in the minds of those who survived it. And Death Wish 3 captured a nation torn between desperation and defiance, reflecting how every era invents its own version of justice when the real one feels too far away. Together, these films remind us that the stories we deem too extreme or too dangerous often say more about the world that rejects them than the filmmakers who create them. They are mirrors held up to uncomfortable realities, and sometimes the reflection is what frightens us most. In cinema, every reel hides a reality, and every cut hides a confession. So now the question is yours. Which of these films revealed too much, and which one deserved to be seen without fear, without edits, without the shadows imposed by someone else's comfort? Your voice shapes what survives. Let it be loud. Real secrets where the truth was always in the edit.